everybody. So, you're about to listen to a talk given by Enzo of Unity and Struggle. And Enzo's exploring in this piece why we should not have a formation like the party for today's time, why it might not be the correct form to have. And dives into some of the reasons and uses the Black autonomous movement, specifically from a few decades ago, but feels really, really relevant for today to understand how having the party form, as many leftists might imagine it, might not be the best idea. And Enzo closes out by helping us to imagine what leftist networks, leftist cadre formations could actually be in this moment, and how they could be helpful to fostering overall struggle, and dives into examples like SNCC in order to understand that. So enjoy.
One that has been put forward is to build a cadre organization or the party that could become the party. We disagree with this for two reasons. One, we feel that it is taking a single historical moment and attempting to apply it ahistorically to a number of different situations. And two, we see that there's a chauvinism endemic to within the left that often shows itself as the black and white unite and fight, and misunderstands the primacy of autonomous struggles and the push and pull dialectical relationship between self-activity of the class and the organizational forms that we take. So in Noel Ignatiev's Black Worker, White Worker, he starts off with a series of anecdotes showing, the solidarity that happens on the shop floor in the workplace between Black workers and white workers. But he notes that outside of the workplace in the reproductive hours, white workers tend to take on more reactionary forms of struggle, white flight, segregation, etc. In contrast to this, he looks at the Black struggle, and he says, by the Black struggle, I mean the autonomous Black movement. I do not mean any particular organization, although a number of organizations are part of it. I'm referring to the tendency on the part of large numbers of Black people, especially workers, to find ways of acting together, independent of white control and white approval, and to decide their course of action based simply on what they feel is good for Black people, not what serves some so-called larger movement. Of this, he says, the daily activities of Black people, especially the Black workers, are the best existing model for the aspirations of the workers generally as a distinct class of people. The activities of the Black workers are the most advanced outposts of the new society we seek to establish. And kind of looking at both of these kind of movements, he says, but what about those cases where the struggle of Black workers and Black people against racial discrimination appears to conflict with the desire to unify the largest possible number of workers behind what are called general class demands? For example, as sometimes happens, when the aggressiveness of Black workers in pursuing their fight for equality tends to alienate white workers who might be willing to join them in common efforts to achieve some reform of immediate and direct benefit to both groups. He says of that, then the trouble begins, and we must admit that some left-wing groups, especially those dominated by whites, are all too willing to set aside the special demands of the Black struggle. CLR James says something very similar in the revolutionary answer to the Negro problem in the US. And I will say that I am focusing mainly on the Black struggle, autonomous Black struggle, because that's something that I know best. But we think that this can be applied broadly to autonomous struggles of, say, women and non-men, queers, etc. So CLR James says, we can compare what we have to say that is new by comparing it to previous positions on the Black question in the socialist movement, the proletariat, as we know, must lead the struggles of all oppressed and all those who are persecuted by capitalism. But this has been interpreted in the past, and by some very good socialists too, in the following sense: the independent struggles of the Black people have not got much more than an episodic value, and as a matter of fact can constitute a great danger not only to Black folks themselves, but to the organized labor movement. The real leadership of the Black struggle must rest in the hands of organized labor and of the Marxist Party. And he says, we, on the other hand, say something entirely different. Number one, that the Black struggle, the independent Black struggle, has a vitality and a validity of its own, that it has deep historic roots in the past of America and in present struggles. It has an organic political perspective along which it is traveling to one degree or another, and everything shows that at the present time it is traveling with great speed and vigor. He was writing this in the 30s and 40s, but he is obviously talking about now. Number two, that this independent Black struggle, Black movement is able to intervene with terrific force upon the general social and political life of the nation, despite the fact that it is waged under the banner of democratic rights and not and is not led necessarily either by the organized labor movement or the Marxist Party. And number three, this is the most important point, that it is able to exercise a powerful influence upon the revolutionary proletariat, that it has got a great contribution to make to the development of the proletariat in the United States, and that it is in itself a constituent part of the struggle for socialism. Additionally, this squares with what Fanon says of how where the revolution starts and where and how it progresses. Fanon notes specifically that the initial revolt against colonization is that self-activity, the coming upon ourselves as that subject. And the revolution progresses through nationalism and through into revolution and decolonization. And he notes specifically that it's not a black and white unite and fight that destroys colonization. It is in fact the colonizers seeing themselves in the liberation struggle of Black people that is the creation of that new subjectivity. But Fanon also notes that it is not simply self-activity that pushes the struggle beyond to true revolution, to the creation of a new society. He says that there always has to be the kernel pointing towards that new subjectivity first, and that is central. So if we are not looking at kind of the unitary party or the mass party or the party that can become the party as the form of organization that this would take, what then do we propose? And from here, we pull from Salar Mohandessi's party as the articulator. And there are three main points that Mohandessi makes in this: class composition, articulation, and what is the party. Of composition, Mohandessi says, the process through which individuals come together as a collective social force is called composition. In the past, there was a tendency to see this primarily in class terms, with the assumption that the only real social force was one based in some kind of objective class position. But class is not the only way that social forces can frame their subjectivity. In fact, when individuals come together as a collective, they lay hold to a vast array of compositional determinants, most of which are outside of their control, that can nevertheless be subjectively activated and repurposed to accomplish certain tasks. So then if that is that is composition, what is then articulation. For Mohandesi, articulation refers to if composition refers to the way that individuals come together as social forces, articulation refers to the ways that social forces combine into forms of unity. And if composition is a daunting process, articulation poses an even greater challenge. Harmonizing a multitude of interests, experiences, backgrounds, and objectives over a sustained period, building unity while taking into account real differences is incredibly difficult work, which is why articulation of this kind is quite rare. And so if that is articulation, what is the party as articulator? Mohandesi continues. Instead of treating the party as a single fixed entity that tries to conquer state power, we can think of the party as an organization among others, one defined by its articulating function as that which unites disparate social forces, links struggles over time, and facilitates the collective project of building socialism beyond the state. While all organizations exist to coordinate the collective capacity to act, parties coordinate the vast field of organizations invented through the self-activity of social forces. As that which facilitates the organizational efforts of these diverse social forces, the party, it can be imagined as a kind of meta-organization. And the primary task of the party is not actually to create social forces, but rather to facilitate their coming together into a broader unity. The party then acts as a kind of binding element, trying to find a way to bring together diverse social forces and help them stay together despite the many tendencies pulling them apart. So with that as kind of background, how do we see this playing out? And we look to, or I look to SNCC as one example of this. So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, came out of the sit-in movement, but the sit-in movement itself was not a spontaneous eruption. In fact, the sit-in movement was itself the product of a network, in fact, the NAACP's network of student chapters. These students, both college and high school, were tired of essentially doing nothing because all of the NAACP's work was legal. So one group within this network did the first sit-in, but within that, there was an explosion of the self-activity, and through that self-activity was born SNCC. And SNCC continued that self-activity through the sit-ins and through the freedom rides, asking questions of the government saying, hey, are you really willing to enforce these new Supreme Court rulings? The government obviously was not, and attempted to shift them to voter registration work where they thought they would just kind of peter out and die. But in fact, SNCC just became the vanguard of the civil rights movement again. And in 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project was born. Now, SNCC was not alone in the Mississippi Freedom Project. They were actually a part of of COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations. But the groups that you might expect to have been there were not. So although there was a lot of great rhetoric that was coming out, the more lefty groups or individuals like Malcolm X, RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement, socialist organizations, labor organizations, etc., they were not a part of COFO. The groups that were a part of COFO were the NAACP, the SCLC, CORE, which was the Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC. But regardless of the people who were a part of COFO, it became larger than the sum of its parts. And so within the Mississippi Freedom Summer, a truly radical moment was born. And for lack of a better word, a dual power movement was born as well. And so we see that the Mississippi Freedom Summer bore out this incredible moment, but also through the struggles that SNCC engaged in, out of SNCC was born the Black Power movement. In fact, exploded out of both SNCC and the Civil Rights Movement, kind of signaling an end to this. So we can see that SNCC was an organization born of the self-activity of the class, and then through that organization bore out more self-activity and furthered the struggle. And we look to this and say, what if COFO was not just SNCC, CORE, the NAACP and SCLC? What if CORE and SNCC were not just the only kind of lefty groups that were in this organization, but what if there had already existed a network that had the experience of coordinated action over many years, and not only coordinated action, but learning the lessons that each of those organizations were involved in through that. And so we can also see what if these organizations, COFO or a lefty COFO, existed during the George Floyd movement, and there were a number of different organizations involved very strongly in the George Floyd uprisings, rather than just kind of as disparate individuals, but as an organization that had already had the lessons and the experience of coordinated action. And we see this as something that the Marxist Center could be. Thank you.